Aries, pause for a moment. Wow. The energy opening this reading feels filled with so many thoughts that have never quite been spoken out loud. It feels like there's someone who has spent a lot more time thinking about you than they would ever admit. And the more they reflect on everything that's happened, the more they're beginning to realize they may have underestimated this connection. This person sees the changes in you. They see the way you've kept moving forward. They see the way you've gradually become stronger, calmer, more grounded in yourself. And honestly, it's making them wonder whether they still hold a place in your world at all. This energy isn't just about missing someone. It's deeper than that. There's regret here. There's the weight of things that should have been said a long time ago, but somehow never were. Part of them wants to move closer. Part of them still worries about what could happen if they finally speak from the heart. So, take what resonates and gently leave the rest. Trust your intuition as you move through this reading. Because what comes through here is someone who doesn't seem able to ignore their feelings for you as easily as they once did. And, that realization appears to be growing stronger with time. Aries, the very first thing I notice when I tap into this energy is the silence. Not the kind of silence that comes when everything is over. This feels more like the silence that settles in when someone has been thinking about something for far too long, but still doesn't know where to begin the conversation. It feels like there's someone here who has spent a significant amount of time thinking about you. And what's interesting is that the harder they try to focus on other things, the more their mind seems to drift back to memories connected to you. A familiar song, a place they happened to pass by, a sentence they heard somewhere that suddenly reminded them of you. Little things like that keep pulling their thoughts back to the same place. This energy feels like someone looking back at everything through a completely different lens than before. When they were still living inside this story, I don't think they fully understood the value of what they had. Partly because they were dealing with their own struggles. Partly because they assumed everything would still be there. There would always be more time. There would always be another opportunity. There would always be a chance to say what needed to be said. But distance has a way of revealing what familiarity once concealed. And now, as they look back, they're beginning to realize that Aries has changed far more than they expected. Not just on the surface, it's the way you've kept moving forward. It's the way you've slowly rebuilt your life. It's the feeling that you didn't stay standing in the place where they left you. And honestly, that realization confuses them. Because part of them is still holding on to an older version of you. Somewhere in their mind, they thought that if they ever turned around and looked back, everything would still be exactly the same. But the more they observe, the more they realize that time has quietly changed a lot of things. What weighs on this person the most isn't what they've already lost. It's the possibility that they could truly lose you. And those are two very different feelings. Losing something often creates regret. Realizing you may never get it back creates fear. And that fear comes through very strongly here. I feel a lot of inner conflict. Part of them wants to believe there's still time to make sense of certain things. Part of them isn't sure whether you still look at them the way you once did. The more they watch Aries, the more they see someone stepping into a stronger version of themselves. This isn't loud energy. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You don't have to announce that you're doing better. Yet somehow, your quiet confidence says more than words ever could, and this person sees it. They see you continuing to live your life. They see that your world no longer revolves around what happened. They see you slowly reclaiming your sense of worth. And strangely enough, that only makes their thoughts grow louder. Because the more they witness your growth, the more they begin asking themselves difficult questions. Was I too late? Was I too stubborn? Were there things I should have said a long time ago? The Nine of Swords card doesn't feel dramatic here. It feels like someone lying awake with thoughts they can't quite escape. Someone replaying old conversations over and over in their mind. Someone wondering whether things would look different today if they had made a different choice back then. And the interesting thing is that the harder they try not to think about Aries, the more Aries seems to occupy their mind. Almost as if something inside them keeps whispering that there is still something unresolved here. And as this energy continues to unfold, it honestly feels like we're only seeing the beginning of what this person has been carrying inside. Because behind all of these thoughts, behind all of these restless nights and unanswered questions, there seems to be another truth waiting beneath the surface. A truth they may not be fully ready to face just yet. What's standing out to me here is that this person isn't running from their thoughts the way they used to. It feels like a long stretch of time has passed in avoidance. Whenever emotions started rising to the surface, they found something to distract themselves. Work, responsibilities, other plans, sometimes even silence itself. But eventually, there comes a point when silence is no longer strong enough to cover what's happening inside. And honestly, that's where this person seems to be now. This energy feels like someone standing in front of a door they've intentionally kept closed for a very long time. They know exactly what's behind it. Unanswered questions, conversations that never happened, explanations that were never given, feelings they once convinced themselves they could leave behind. What catches my attention most isn't the longing, it's the accountability. Because somewhere in the middle of all these thoughts, this person is beginning to see things more honestly than before. Instead of only focusing on what they've been through, they're starting to think about what Aries has been through. And that's a significant shift. For a long time, they viewed this story through their own lens. Now it feels like they're trying to step into your shoes. And once they do that, certain truths become much harder to ignore. They're realizing there were things that should have been said sooner, conversations that never should have been delayed for so long, moments where honesty might have changed everything. This energy feels like someone coming face to face with themselves. Not many excuses left, not many places left to hide. Just the simple truth that some choices made in the past created distance between two people. Now, that doesn't feel like guilt to me. It feels more like an awakening. Almost like someone suddenly seeing the entire picture after spending years looking at only small pieces of it. I also get the feeling that this person has been paying much closer attention than you realize. Not in a negative way. More like they're quietly trying to understand who you are now, how you're feeling, how you've changed. Whether the door to communication is still open between the two of you. Because the more they reflect, the more they realize that what they need isn't more time to avoid things. What they need is courage. The courage to speak honestly. The courage to acknowledge their imperfections. The courage to accept that a conversation may not unfold exactly the way they hope. There's something deeply emotional about that. Because this person seems to understand that Aries deserves more than silence, more than unanswered questions. More than mixed signals and uncertainty, you deserve honesty. And that's why the regret coming through in this reading doesn't feel dramatic. It feels quiet. Like someone sitting alone and realizing that not everything in life is lost because love wasn't there. Sometimes things drift apart because the most important words were never spoken when they needed to be. And, I also feel an apology living somewhere inside this person's mind, not spoken yet, not sent, but beginning to take shape. Not an apology meant to erase the past. Not one meant to undo everything that happened. More like a need to finally be honest with their own feelings after spending so long trying to control them. As this energy continues to unfold, it feels like this person is standing very close to an important threshold in their inner journey. Because after facing the truth, the next question is no longer about how they feel. The real question is what they're going to do with emotions they can no longer pretend don't exist. What makes this energy so powerful isn't what the other person is feeling. It's what Aries has stopped accepting. Because sometimes the biggest shift in a connection doesn't begin with the person who wants to come back. It begins with the person who decides they can no longer keep living the same way. I feel like there was a period of time when everything kept moving in familiar circles. Conversations that never really went anywhere. Promises that never fully turned into action. Distance showing up, disappearing, and then showing up all over again. Almost like two people walking around the same circle without either one truly stepping outside of it. But somewhere along the way, something inside Aries changed. Not dramatically, not loudly. It feels more like someone waking up after months of convincing themselves to be patient just a little longer. One more chance, one more attempt, one more time. Until they finally realize that patience and self-sacrifice are not always the same thing. And from that moment forward, your energy started to shift. You stopped trying to fix everything by yourself. You stopped carrying the responsibility of holding everything together. You stopped chasing answers from other people in order to find peace within yourself. And honestly, that change created a very interesting effect. Because once Aries stopped participating in those familiar cycles, the other person suddenly didn't know what to do with the space that was left behind. The old reaction stopped producing the same results. The old approaches stopped working the way they used to. What once made them feel secure now leaves them feeling confused. I can feel the energy of someone staring directly at patterns they've repeated for a very long time. At first, they didn't even recognize them. It was just habit, the way they always handled emotions, the way they always responded whenever fear or uncertainty showed up. the way they protected themselves when things felt out of control. But once Aries stopped responding the same way, the mirror appeared. And, wow, sometimes the hardest thing isn't seeing someone else's mistakes, it's seeing your own. I think that's why this person is experiencing so much inner conflict right now. Because they're beginning to understand that some of these problems didn't come from circumstances. They didn't come from timing. They didn't come from outside influences. They came from parts of themselves they never truly faced. Old fears, protective walls, ways of behaving that existed for so long they started believing they were simply part of who they were. But the more they look back, the more they realize those patterns cost them more than they ever understood. And the person occupying their thoughts the most right now is Aries. Not because you're trying to make them regret anything, not because you're trying to prove a point, but because you're living differently. Your energy now feels like someone who knows their worth. Someone who understands that love doesn't mean accepting everything. Someone who understands that kindness doesn't require abandoning personal boundaries. And that creates a powerful contrast, because the other person is beginning to see a version of Aries they may have never fully looked at before. A calmer Aries, a wiser Aries, an Aries who no longer allows emotions to make every decision. And that version of you is forcing them to ask difficult questions. What if I had handled things differently? What if I had been more honest? What if I understood then what I understand now? Those questions still don't have answers, but I do feel like they're leading this person somewhere important. A place where they can no longer keep turning away from the truth about themselves. And as that process continues, another layer of emotion starts rising to the surface. Because behind all this awareness, behind all these lessons and realizations, there seems to be another fear quietly growing inside them. A fear that feels much more personal than anything they've faced so far. What I feel very strongly as this energy continues to unfold is that this person is beginning to face a fear they've spent a long time trying to push aside. And interestingly enough, it doesn't feel like a fear of rejection. It doesn't even feel like a fear of having a difficult conversation. It feels more like the fear that time may have truly changed everything. Because the more they reflect on this journey, the more they realize Aries is no longer standing where they left you. You've been through a lot. You've worked through emotions on your own. You've learned how to find your balance without relying on someone else to provide all the answers. And honestly, what confuses this person is that they no longer know where they fit into the picture of your life today. That's a strange feeling, especially for someone who once believed this connection would always be there. Who believed that no matter how complicated things became, there would always be time to come back to it later. But distance has a very unique way of creating clarity. When two people are no longer part of each other's everyday lives, certain things begin to stand out. Things that once felt ordinary suddenly become precious. Things that were postponed suddenly feel important. And emotions that were pushed aside somehow find their way back to the surface. I feel like this person is moving through exactly that process, because instead of only remembering the big moments, they're starting to remember the small ones. The conversations that seemed insignificant at the time. The moments of sharing little details about the day. The habits and routines they never imagined would matter so much. And somehow, it's those simple memories that are helping them realize that Aries occupied a much larger space in their life than they ever fully acknowledged. You know, sometimes we only understand someone's value when their familiar presence is no longer there. That's exactly what this energy feels like. Not dramatic, not overwhelming. Just a realization that keeps growing deeper as time goes on. And alongside that realization, a question keeps showing up in their mind more and more often. What if Aries is truly moving forward? What if Aries has found peace without me? What if this distance has changed things in ways that can't simply be undone? Those aren't comfortable questions, but they're forcing this person to become more honest with themselves. Because for a long time, they tried to keep everything inside a safe zone. They didn't name their feelings. They didn't look directly at what their heart was trying to tell them. They didn't allow themselves to acknowledge how important this connection really was. But the more they tried to control those emotions, the clearer those emotions became. I can feel something softening within them. Almost like protective walls that existed for years are beginning to thin out. The reasons they once used to justify the distance don't carry the same weight anymore. The explanations that once sounded convincing no longer feel convincing to them. What's left is the truth of how they feel. And those feelings seem to be leading them toward a simple realization. Not everyone leaves the same imprint on your life. Some people come and go. But some people change something inside you simply because they were there. And I think that's what this person is beginning to understand. Not because Aries is perfect. Not because Aries never made mistakes. But because among all the people they've met, your energy carried something uniquely meaningful. Something they haven't easily found elsewhere. And as that truth continues to settle into their heart, emotions they've kept buried for a very long time are starting to find their way into the light. It's almost as if they're reaching a point where staying silent feels far more difficult than being honest with themselves. And, wow, that shift feels much bigger than they may be ready to admit. As all of these emotions continue rising to the surface, the energy begins moving into an even deeper layer. This no longer feels like a story about missing someone. It no longer feels like simple regret. It feels more like the moment when a person finally starts seeing everything that happened without trying to reshape the truth into something easier to live with. And honestly, there's a strong sense of awakening here. Not the loud kind, not the sudden kind. It feels more like fog slowly lifting on a quiet morning, allowing things to appear exactly as they are. I get the feeling that this person has been reflecting on all the influences that once affected this connection. Some of them came from their environment. Some came from advice they received. Some came from fears they never fully named. And for some of you, it almost feels like there were outside voices that caused them to question their own feelings. Not because anyone intentionally wanted to hurt them, but because when we're not fully clear about what our heart is trying to say, it's easy to become influenced by other people's perspectives. What's interesting is that this person now seems to be pulling away from all that noise, almost like they're sitting alone with their own thoughts for the first time in a very long time. No outside opinions, no familiar explanations, no old stories they've been telling themselves, just the truth. And the truth is usually much simpler than we expect. I feel like they're beginning to realize there were things they knew all along but never had the courage to face. Because once they face them, they can no longer pretend they don't care. They can no longer tell themselves this was just a passing connection. They can no longer reduce Aries to a small chapter in their life story. Some emotions have a strange way of returning no matter how deeply they're buried. And this person seems to understand that now more than ever. One image keeps appearing very clearly here. It's the image of someone wanting to say something, but still standing at the edge of hesitation, like someone who has already rehearsed countless conversations in their mind. Someone who has imagined every possible explanation. Someone who has gone over every word again and again. Yet whenever the moment to actually face the truth gets closer, they pause. Not because they don't know what to say, but because they understand that once the truth is spoken, things won't remain exactly the same. And sometimes that's the most frightening part, because truth changes something. Regardless of the outcome, it shifts the way people see a situation. It changes the perspective. It changes the story. And it changes the person speaking it. There's also something deeply touching about this energy, because this person no longer seems as concerned with protecting their image as they once were. They're becoming more interested in being honest with themselves, and that's a big shift. Some people spend years building walls around their heart, years convincing themselves those walls are necessary. But eventually they realize those walls don't just keep other people out. They also keep their own truth trapped inside. And as that awareness continues to grow, I can feel a confession slowly forming within them. Not necessarily a confession directed toward Aries yet. It feels like a confession they're making to themselves first. A quiet acknowledgement that there are feelings they no longer want to deny, truths they no longer want to avoid, and an acceptance that this connection affected them far more deeply than they once allowed themselves to admit. As this energy keeps moving forward, it feels like this person is standing very close to an important crossroads. Because once the truth becomes clear, maintaining silence starts feeling heavier with every passing day. And wow, I don't think they're able to ignore that weight the way they once did. There's a quiet pressure building inside this person now. Not pressure coming from the outside world. More like the feeling that they can't keep carrying all of this inside their head much longer. Because after all the reflection, all the self-questioning, and all the truths they've begun to see more clearly, a very strong need is emerging. A need to speak, a need to explain, a need to finally put these long-held emotions where they belong. I feel like this person has spent a significant amount of time communicating with Aries only in their mind. They've imagined conversations, they've replayed old memories. They've thought about questions you may have wanted to ask. And honestly, there are moments when it feels like they've even answered those questions on your behalf. But eventually they started realizing that no imagined conversation can replace a real one. Because the longer everything stays inside, the larger the empty spaces become. And what's interesting is that this energy doesn't feel like someone trying to justify themselves. It feels like someone trying to explain themselves. And those are two very different things. Justification usually comes from wanting to prove you're right. Explanation comes from wanting someone to understand what was happening beneath actions that were never properly expressed. And I think that's exactly where this person is right now. Because they're beginning to understand that some things in the past created misunderstandings that never needed to exist. Moments of silence that were interpreted in completely different ways. Reactions that caused both people to view the same story through entirely different lenses. The more time passes, the more they realize that certain things were never truly clarified. Not because they didn't care, but because both of you were looking at the same situation from very different perspectives. I also noticed something softening within this energy. The emotional walls that once felt so strong don't seem nearly as powerful anymore. There's a sincerity coming through that feels difficult to ignore. Almost like this person is becoming tired of pretending everything is fine, tired of acting unaffected, tired of keeping every feeling locked inside a box that nobody is allowed to see. And the closer they get to facing the truth, the more they seem to understand that communication isn't always about changing the outcome. Sometimes it's simply about saying what should have been said a long time ago. I also sense a little anxiety here. Not anxiety about what to say, but anxiety about how it might be received. Because when the heart starts becoming more honest, vulnerability becomes more real too. This person understands that opening up always carries some level of risk, but they're also beginning to realize that remaining silent forever comes with a cost of its own. That's why I see so many emotions moving in the same direction, almost like different roads eventually leading to the same destination, a conversation, an explanation. A moment where things left unresolved finally have the opportunity to be placed on the table with honesty, not to change the past, not to erase what happened, but to allow both people to look back at this story with more truth than assumption. And as this energy continues moving forward, I feel this person slowly stepping closer to a more mature version of themselves. Because after everything they've learned, the question inside their heart no longer seems to be whether they should speak or remain silent. The deeper question now is whether they're truly ready to become the person Aries deserves to meet. There's a very noticeable shift happening in this energy now. Not the kind of change that turns someone's life upside down overnight. It feels more like the slow realization that they can no longer keep living from older versions of themselves. And honestly, I feel like this person is moving through a much deeper level of maturity than they were before. What's interesting is that this growth doesn't seem to come from success. It doesn't come from things working out perfectly. It comes from lessons they were forced to face, losses, regrets, moments of looking back, and understanding that certain choices led them somewhere they never intended to go. You know, sometimes life teaches us through experiences we never would have chosen for ourselves. But those experiences often become the very things that create real transformation. And that's exactly what this feels like. I don't sense the energy of someone who still wants to blame circumstances. I don't feel someone constantly searching for outside reasons to explain everything away. Instead, I see someone beginning to ask themselves much harder questions. What did I do? What did I miss? What needs to change so I don't keep repeating the same patterns? And wow, not everyone is willing to sit with questions like that. Because seeing your own mistakes is often far more difficult than seeing someone else's. There's also a strong feeling of rebuilding here, almost like this person is trying to reorganize their life from the ground up, not only in love, but in the way they manage their emotions, the way they respond to pressure, the way they make decisions. I can feel a significant difference between who they used to be and who they're trying to become. In the past, many of their choices seem to have come from fear or impulse or emotional survival. Now there's a different energy emerging, more long-term thinking, more responsibility, more intention, more awareness of consequences. That's why I keep seeing the image of someone slowly reclaiming control of their own life. Not to prove anything to anyone, but because they're beginning to understand that if nothing changes internally, the external story eventually repeats itself. And Aries seems to hold a very unique place within that process. Not because you were trying to teach them a lesson, not because you forced them to change, but because your presence once allowed them to see a better version of themselves. And when distance entered the picture, the memory of that feeling stayed behind. almost like a mirror they can't forget. Every time they look into it, they become more aware of how far they've come and how far they still want to go. I also notice a completely different energy emerging now, steady, grounded, calm. The emotional chaos that surrounded the earlier parts of this story doesn't feel nearly as strong anymore. It's almost as if this person is finally understanding that love isn't expressed through feelings alone. It's expressed through consistency, through responsibility, through showing up when it matters instead of only showing up when emotions are intense. And that's a profound realization, because some people spend years learning that lesson. This energy makes me feel like they're moving closer to the version of themselves Aries may have once hoped to see. Not perfect, not transformed into someone entirely different, just more authentic, more mature, more accountable for what they say and what they feel. And as this process continues unfolding, it feels like a new door is slowly opening within them. Because after learning how to face themselves, after learning how to take responsibility, after learning how to rebuild the foundation of their life, their heart seems to be turning toward a different question now, a much deeper one. A question about what they genuinely want to hold on to before too much distance grows between where they are and what truly matters to them. A very different kind of energy begins to emerge as this story approaches its final chapter. This no longer feels like someone standing still and watching from a distance. It no longer feels like someone endlessly thinking, analyzing, and keeping everything locked away inside. What I feel now is movement, a shift happening internally that's starting to create a need for action. And honestly, when you look back at this entire journey, there's something almost ironic about it. The person who once created the distance is now the one who has been transformed by that distance the most. The person who believed they needed space from their feelings ended up spending countless hours thinking about those very feelings. Life has a strange way of working sometimes, not to punish anyone, not to teach some dramatic lesson, but simply to help us see more clearly what truly matters. And I feel like this person is slowly arriving at their own conclusion. A conclusion that doesn't come from anyone else's advice. It doesn't come from outside pressure. It comes from everything they've lived through over the past period of time. Because after looking back on the past, after facing parts of themselves they once avoided, after understanding the role Aries has played in their life, they no longer seem comfortable staying in the middle. This energy feels like someone finally beginning to understand what they want, and that changes everything. For a long time, much of their hesitation came from not fully understanding themselves, not fully understanding their emotions, not fully understanding what was actually worth holding on to. But now, the feeling I get is that things are becoming clearer little by little. Not clear because every answer has appeared, but clear in their heart, clear in the things they no longer want to lose. One image keeps appearing very strongly here. It's the image of someone wanting to move forward instead of continuing to wait. Almost like a person who stood on the other side of a door for a very long time and is finally taking a step toward it. Not because they're certain about what will happen next, but because they understand that doing nothing would mean carrying unanswered questions for the rest of the journey. And that's a realization that seems difficult to ignore now. I also sense a great deal of seriousness in this energy, very different from earlier stages where emotions were constantly being pulled back and forth by fear, impulsiveness, or outside influences. This feels more grounded, more mature, more stable, almost like they're thinking not only about what they feel today, but also about what they want to build over time. That's why I keep seeing the image of someone trying to bring their heart and their mind into alignment, no longer fighting their emotions, no longer trying to prove they don't care, no longer pretending not to see what has become impossible to ignore. And Aries still seems to hold a very special place within that process, not simply because of beautiful memories, not only because of love, but because you represent an important part of their growth, a part that made them reflect on themselves, a part that inspired change, a part that helped them understand that mature love isn't only about feelings. It's also about responsibility, presence, consistency, and the choices we make every day. I think that's why this energy feels like a turning point. Not because everything suddenly becomes perfect, not because all the answers magically appear, but because someone is finally stopping their attempt to run from what their heart has known for a very long time. And standing at that threshold, the feeling I receive is that this connection is entering a completely different chapter than the one we've been looking at until now. A chapter where silence no longer takes center stage. A chapter where honest choices seem ready to find their own path forward. And, wow, that feels like a very different place from where this story first began.